Please join me in welcoming to Boise and to the podium, Donovan D. Rypkema.
Thank you, Mayor. That was very kind. Most of it untrue, but doesn't mean it was not appreciated. The last time I was in Boise was 9 years ago, and it really has. I mean, this is a place I got here early and spent Wednesday afternoon walking around, and it really is a city that has changed itself in a positive fashion. And the stuff that's been added it really is an important contribution, and 50 years from now, the equivalent of this room full of people will be here saying, those are the buildings we have to save. I'm sorry to give this analogy, but I haven't come up with another one. I grew up in western South Dakota, and my dad was in part in the cattle business. And in the cattle business, if you're going to add a new bull or a registered cow, it doesn't have to be the best one in the herd, but it has to be better than the average of the herd, or the only thing that can happen is the quality of the whole herd goes down. And conversely, when you cull out animals in November or October in South Dakota, you don't get rid of the best ones, you get rid of the worst ones. Well, I think that there's lots of evidence, both in what's been saved in, well, of course there's losses, but what's been saved in and redeveloped in Boise and what's built certainly meets that test. That what's being added is better than the quality of the average. And what's gotten rid of, the City Hall being an unfortunate exception, is less than the quality of the average. So I think that's the way you make great cities that are distinguished, is you keep building on what you have. Every new building doesn't have to be the best in town, but if it's not better than the average, you're not helping the city as a whole. So I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of things, and I'm a real estate numbers guy, so I am going to apologize to you that this may seem like the eternal economics seminar, but I'll apologize in advance if that painful. It may be, and so those of you who doze off are absolutely understand it. For about 25 years, there have been studies about the economic impact of historic preservation. My firm has done some, others have done them, and they've nearly always been on the statewide level. And regardless of who did them, the kind of big four that emerged were these: downtown revitalization, heritage tourism, the incremental difference in heritage tourism versus others, jobs and income created by the process of rehabilitation, and the impact of local historic districts on property values. Those are kind of the big four. And I'll tell you how that's merged. But I want to give you some examples of all of this in kind of studies we've done recently on those big four, and then I'll move to some others. So a couple years ago, we did an analysis of the almost 30-year history of the North Carolina Main Street program. You have a Main Street program here in Idaho, and it deserves to grow and get bigger and serve more of your communities. But Main Street, there is no form of economic development of any kind, any place in America. I don't care about downtown revitalization, historic preservation, anything. There is no program of economic development that is more cost effective than Main Street, period, no exception. So I don't even care if you don't like anything about old buildings. If you're about economic development, your community needs to be involved in Main Street. So we did this study. North Carolina was one of the original 6 Main Street communities. So they had boxes and boxes of old data. And here's some of the data from that. So over the lifetime of that program, it's $2.5 billion with a B investment in those communities, Main Street communities. About half of that from the public sector, about the other half from the private sector. There have been almost 5,000 net new businesses. One of the really important things about Main Street, the Main Street Center did the right when they began, is they required that local program managers keep track of what's happening. Go out and do the work and gather the data, but it's this data that's demonstrated over time how effective it is, and it's really a key component of the whole thing. It's economic development. And in economic development, you can't talk about fluffy stuff. If you want to be taken seriously, you got to say, here's what we've done. Here's where we were yesterday. Here's where we are today. And so 4,500 net new businesses over that time period. 18,000 net new jobs in these mostly small towns in North Carolina. 4,500 buildings that were rehabilitated. And here's, I come from the political spectrum that we ought to be frugal with taxpayers' dollars. Lifetime budget for the Main Street program, a little less than $8 million. A couple of years, the legislature said, oh, let's give Main Street a little more money to do special grant programs, even that, so about $12 million. And if you take the number net new jobs created Against that budget, $435 a job. You know, if your state economic development director went to the legislature and say, hey, we created jobs for $45,000 a job, they'd say, well, that's kind of what people are paying these days. 1% of that is what Main Street is creating jobs to. Net cost per new business, $1,600. Think about the money that's spent. I don't mean it's wrong, but the cost effectiveness of this approach to economic development. Georgia is a state that was particularly hurt in the Great Recession. They had a couple of years where, in fact, their state government took in less money than the year before. So it was tough. Unemployment up, but all through that period, when the economy in the state was going down, every one of those years, the Georgia Main Street communities added jobs. They also added net new businesses. The recession notwithstanding, in fact, there was economic growth in those Main Street communities against what was happening in the state in general. In Iowa, one of the great Main Street programs in the country, every year, the property tax generation, and one of the big beneficiaries of Main Street is, in fact, local government. That's why they need to be in the table supporting it. The table, not from all the buildings in the Main Street, just the renovated, incremental renovation generates $11 million a year in local property taxes, and that's what pays cops and teachers and fixes potholes. And talking about cost investment is that in the state of Iowa, it's a program that costs the state about $950,000 a year for their program, so it's reasonably well funded. But it generates, the net new businesses in those Main Street communities generate $43 million a year in revenues to the state. I don't know who, Warren Buffett doesn't have that kind of return on the investment that's being made. So the first one is this kind of role of heritage-based downtown revitalization, and Main Street, of course, is the best example. The second is this issue about heritage tourism. I'm going to give you some data, but I have to tell you, my goal in life is to break this cycle that when you say economics and historic preservation in the same sentence, that the kind of default response is, oh, you must mean heritage tourism. That's an important piece, but that's far from being the whole thing, but it's an important one. In Philadelphia, firm, not ours, great firm of economists who actually know what they're doing instead of us who kind of bluff our way through. They looked at the 5 counties surrounding Philadelphia, the heritage tourism in that area. 45,000 jobs, almost $1 billion in earnings in those 5 counties. But kind of no surprise. I mean, it's the cradle of American democracy. It's great, but it happens at every level. Here's San Antonio. And we looked at visitation in San Antonio. About 60% of people that go to San Antonio and stay overnight fall in the heritage visitors, but even the people who are just coming in for the day, almost half of them in San Antonio are heritage visitors. And tourists spend their money in 5 categories, virtually all their money in 5 categories. Forget the airplane ticket to get there, because that's not, it's not your benefit. That's, United Airlines got that. They spend their money on local transportation, on lodging, on food and beverages, on retail purchases, and on entertainment, admissions, that kind of thing. So we looked at the heritage visitors in San Antonio versus people who went to San Antonio but didn't do any heritage stuff, didn't go to the Alamo, didn't do anything. In every one of those categories, the heritage visitors spent more. So so even with fewer of them, there's a greater economic impact because of the propensity of heritage-based visitors to have a spending pattern much greater than tourists in general. Here's a really interesting kind of factoid, and I learned it first from a guy in Norway who did some analysis of heritage visitation. Lots of you run small historic sites or maybe a small museum, and you go to the county commission or the city council for your annual appropriation, and they'll say to you, geez, you guys aren't even paying for your own light bill. What the hell, why aren't you paying for yourself? Well, the fact is that they don't. We looked in Utah, beyond Salt Lake City, and there's lots of wonderful historic sites around the state, but you have to want to get there, because where are you going in Utah? And what we discovered is that historic site that was often the magnet for them to get there only got $7 of every $100 that the visitor spent. The rest was spent on the rental car, on the gas, on the restaurant, on the shops, in the hotel. So it was the historic site that drew them there, but they weren't the beneficiary. It was the rest of the economy that was the beneficiary. It's kind of like You know, there'll be a big sale at Kmart for toasters for $12 or something. It's a loss leader. They're losing money on that, but that's what gets you into Kmart to buy the other stuff. Well, in some cases, these historic sites are really the loss leader. There's what drawing in so other parts of the local economy can benefit. The U.S. government does some things good, some things not so good. But one thing that the Department of Commerce does very good in that they survey international visitors coming into the United States by plane. And that eliminates kind of the daily crossover between Canada and Mexico. So you got to really be serious. On a plane, flying from someplace to the United States. And they have a category called cultural tourists. The tourism industry kind of likes to pretend that there's an exactitude in their definitions, but there's not. There's a little sloppy stuff. But my best guess is that probably 80% of the people who constitute cultural tourists are probably heritage tourists. I mean, you go to the opera in a new building, so you'd be a cultural visitor and not a heritage visitor. But I think there's enough statistical crossover so the numbers are the same. And here's what they found. First of all, they spend more nights in hotels than do other visitors who didn't fall in that category. They visited 2 or more states more often. Here's the reality. If international visitors are going to come to the United States and just go to one place, it's going to be New York, California, or Florida. If the other 47 states of us want visitors, we've got to find the kind of visitors willing to explore more, and that's what cultural tourists do that tourists in general don't necessarily do. They spend more per visit when they come here. 470,000 more international visitors visit historic sites than go to amusement parks. 785,000 more visit historic sites than go to the beach. 3 times as many visit historic sites as go to the casino. 4 times as many visit historic sites as play golf. So it's a major industry, and places increasingly all over the country can take advantage. Then I'm introduced as a preservationist, but I'm really in the economic development business. And one of the real powerful things, I don't care if you like gargoyles and old buildings, if you just care about having local jobs, preservation is an important component of that. The state of Georgia, we did a study a few years ago and looked at the numbers of jobs per $1 million worth of output that are created in Georgia. And output means you have a widget factory and you produce $1 million worth of widgets. Then what does that mean in terms of numbers of jobs and income that those jobs generate? So we made a bunch of comparisons. Well, the citizens of Georgia spent $1 gazillion to attract some automobile manufacturer. That's all right, it's their money, they can do what they want. But $1 million worth of automobile construction manufacture in the state of Georgia creates 3.5 jobs in the state of Georgia and $245,000 in paychecks. I don't know how many of you have ever had to fly through the horrible Atlanta airport. Avoid it at all costs if you can. But $1 million worth of those airplane tickets is 9 jobs and $476,000 in income. New construction, build a new building in Georgia for $1 million, 15 jobs, $616,000 in income. Spend $1 million rehabilitating a historic building, 18 jobs and $750,000. Now, where's the economic development in that equation? Here is the city of Pittsburgh, where we looked at a kind of 30-year period, and preservation activity tends to be volatile. It'll go up and down. But over that 30-year life, there was an average of 511 jobs created in those projects in the city of Pittsburgh every year. Now, if a mayor came and announced, hey, I've attracted an industry to town and they're going to have 500 jobs, it would be reelected with no opposition. But that's what preservation is doing all the way through. In the state of North Carolina, there's a state tax credit in North Carolina, and we looked in the city of Raleigh. Well, on average, it's $6 million worth of paychecks in the city of Raleigh that are generated by the use of that state tax credit. Again, in Utah, we kind of made the calculation. What happens? What happens if you spend $1 million rehabilitating a historic building? 10 direct jobs, another 7.5 indirect, total of almost $850,000 in income. Beyond the $1 million spent on the building, that generates almost another $1 million elsewhere in the local economy. And for states out west who kind of hate sending their tax dollars to Washington, and I don't blame you, I live in Washington, but I don't work for them. But that's $200,000 that stays in Utah by definition. That's money that stays in Utah instead of going to those guys, whoever they are, in Washington. Now, Utah, kind of like Idaho, is not a state that has a huge amount of tax rehabilitation, historic preservation. Just numerically is not big. But even what's done there creates almost 200 jobs a year, and if you thought about historic preservation as a single industry, that would be in the top 1% of all of the businesses in Utah. So even we don't think of it as a big, it's a big deal in a state like that. Then there's this issue about property values. What happens when you have a local historic district, and now you have to go to some commission to get tear your porch down, approval and stuff, blah, 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 okay. And what's very interesting, I'm so old, I've seen this whole evolution, and I come from, I'm not anti-real estate, I come from the real estate world, so I'm pro-development, not anti-development, but the argument when local historic districts first were created was this: you're going to put in another layer of regulation, layers of regulation, prima facie, meaning lower property values, so that historic districts are going to hurt property values. Now, with 30 years worth of evidence, the argument is this: those damn historic districts are going to make property values go up, and therefore we're going to have to pay more property taxes. Same guy with the opposite conclusion. So here's Philadelphia, another firm of great economists in Philly, who looked at the change in value over a 30-year period in Philadelphia. And they saw that properties in National Register districts, now remember that National Register district, kind of nice honor, no protection comes from a National Register district. So those National Register district properties have an economic premium of about 14%. The ones in local districts, where there is regulation, is about 22%. Now, I know some of you serve on preservation commissions, and I'm sorry to break your heart, but this premium is not paid for the privilege of appearing before your goofy commission. It's being paid for the confidence that the lunatic across the street's not going to be doing something to his property that has an adverse effect on the value of your property. One of the best studies on this property value thing was done by a professor at University of Louisville, John Gilderbloom, and he looked at this 8-year period broken down to the census block level, and did a big fancy linear regression analysis, meaning that he sorted out every variable that would account for a property A selling for a different amount than property B. Its size, its condition, its whether it have a garage, it have 1 bedroom or 3 or whatever, all of those. So the only thing left was it was in or it was not in a local historic district. And what did he find is over that 8-year period that the historic districts gained about 59,000 to 67,000 more than comparable properties, and those properties gained about 21% in additional value because everything else accounted for, because they're in those local historic districts. Here is San Antonio. And again, for those of you who are in or around the real estate business, we have a time frame here that really is 3 very different phases. We had kind of 10 years up until the mid-2000s where real estate was going up at kind of opium-fueled rates, just kind of lunatic. Then we had a big national crash, everything goes down, and then depending on the part of the country, there was either a gradual or a steady increase in value. And this period, 1999 to 2013, covers all of those cycles. Well, here's in the city of San Antonio, they have historic districts. They also have things called conservation districts that are kind of keeping the neighborhood character, but are less kind of demanding in terms of the design guidelines. And then the rest of the city, and so we looked at the change in property values over that time. Well, who did the best? In the local historic districts. Who did the second best? The conservation districts, both of whom outperformed, simply from an economic development standpoint, than did the city as a whole. This is Canton, Connecticut, small town about 45 minutes northwest of Hartford, the capital. The pink area is a National Register district, within which is a local historic district. So the whole local district is within the National Register district, but again, local district has protections, National Register district does not. And the ratios are about the same as they found in Philly. So in the local district, property value is up about 32%. In the NR district that wasn't local, up 28%. Rest of the city up 22%. So this is preservation premium that's showing up. Here is Savannah, again in this long up, down, and up cycle. Here there's 4 local historic districts and the rest of the city. Every one of those historic districts outperformed the city as a whole. Now, so the Victorian district is really expensive. It's rich people who are living there, and expensive housing. Collier Brownville's the other end. I mean, it's whatever's the opposite of rich neighborhoods, that's what it is. It didn't matter. In fact, all of them outperformed the city as a whole. Here is Here is Savannah. And every one of the National Register districts except one outperformed the city's average in terms of enhanced property value. And then in Utah, we looked at 5 cities that during this kind of up and crash. And with one exception, and I'll show you that in a minute, every one of them, the upside was a little more, the downside less steep, recovery began faster. Park City and Logan and Provo and Salt Lake. And the only exception was Ogden, which in fact has kind of a big, very low rate of home ownership and very mixed use district. It didn't perform as well, but I'll come back to the compensation for that in just a minute. So those are the big 4: jobs and household income, downtown revitalization, heritage tourism, and property values. So because things have changed in the last decade, and 2 big things that affected my little tiny practice is, one is this whole thing of big data and accessible data and data that you can pull up based on geographies. And then I don't know how to do any of that stuff, so I've tapped into my students at Penn and stole them away who do this kind of stuff. And so just smart young people, I'm about 40 years too old, and this data availability has allowed us to kind of probe lots of different things. So those were the big 4. Here's the kind of new 9. Here's something that somebody ought to be paying attention to. The HUD and Mortgage Bankers Association, FHA, and a whole bunch of other people. We've now looked in about 30 cities, and every one of them, the foreclosure rate in historic districts decidedly less than in the city as a whole. This is a big deal. Millions of people lost their life savings in that real estate crash, lost their homes, went back in foreclosure. Well, if there's a variable that shows that different pattern, people ought to be paying attention, for God's sake. So here is almost 1 in 5 single-family houses in Salt Lake faced foreclosure during that time. Historic districts, barely 5%. Including Ogden, by the way, that had, even though the property values fell faster than the city as a whole, even they had a lower foreclosure rate than did the city as a whole. Here is the city of Raleigh. 1 in 10 houses went into foreclosure. The national houses in National Register districts were half of that. The properties in local districts, half of that. So huge statistics. This is no statistical fluke. I mean, this is a big, big difference. Here's San Antonio, every historic district, some rich, most not, didn't matter. Foreclosure rates less in every one of them. This isn't about some kind of architectural style, it is the quality and nature and character of those neighborhoods. Now, we'd like to say, well, people who live in historic neighborhoods, they never get divorced, or they never get fired, or they never run the credit cards up too much. That's not what's happening. It's when I get in financial trouble, in that historic district, because of this kind of latent strength of that market, I can get that property sold before it goes into that foreclosure process. So I think that's what we're seeing here. Then the next one is this stability on the downside. Here is Savannah, and the blue line is the change in value over that 15-year period or 10-year period in Savannah. So the historic district properties outperformed the market in the up years. What happened in the down years? Well, first of all, the decline started later, it was less steep, and the recovery started faster. So in the kind of economic resilience that those historic neighborhoods represent. Then there's this issue of density, the D word. And I'll tell you who likes density. The city controller likes density. The transportation guy likes density. The planners like density. Everybody likes density except the citizens who said, I want density. If I wanted density, I'd move to New York. All right. Okay, just chill for a moment. Here's the city of Raleigh. And I think Raleigh is a city with lots and lots of parallels to Boise. Capital city, strong university presence, very rapid, strong quality growth in the core of the city. I think there's lots of similarities. So we did a study a couple years ago in Raleigh on preservation, and we looked at density. At the beginning of the 20th century, the density in Raleigh was almost 8,000 people per square mile. And then, come along the automobile and sprawl and, exterior growth, and it fell down. So now it's about 2,500 people per square mile in Raleigh. But look at what's happening in the historic districts. The local historic districts have a density of twice as much. Now, here's what's happened. Some of you maybe have participated. There's things called visual preference surveys. So you get a group of people in a room, and you sit and you'll be trying to talk about density. And they say, nah, we don't want that density. Then you'll show them pictures of neighborhoods. And invariably, it doesn't mean they necessarily want to live in that neighborhood, but to say, which neighborhoods do you like the best? Oh, those historic neighborhoods, that's the kind of stuff we want. Well, lo and behold, those are the most dense. That is the density. But it's a density at a human scale, so people like it. They not only don't fight it, they like it. Now, again, my political thing about being frugal with taxpayers' dollars, I have this very bright young colleague, Bree Grosicki, and I said, Bree, tell you what I want you to do. I want you to find 2 neighborhoods in Raleigh, and the only thing I care about is that they're roughly the same size, and one is an historic neighborhood, and one is a relatively new subdivision. That's all I care about, and then we're going to look at the differences. So she's fine, she found them. Oakwood, which is a historic neighborhood, Reedham Oaks, Wyndham, which is a new subdivision. Population, about 1,700 in the historic district, 500 in the new subdivision. Both of them 114 acres. Housing units, about 800 in the historic district, 127 in the subdivision. Average year built 1925 in the historic neighborhood, 1992 in the... So you got it. You can envision those 2 subdivisions. So then we started digging down. So what's the average house size? Oh, about 2,500 in the historic neighborhood, 3,500 in the new subdivision. Okay, some people want bigger houses. No, nothing wrong with that. Property values average about 315,000 in the historic neighborhood, 500 and a quarter in the new subdivision. Taxes per unit, 2,900 in the historic district, 4,800 in the new subdivision. This is where that city finance officer gets a little premature in his conclusions. Saying, yeah, this is why you want these new subdivisions, because that's, okay, just chill for a minute. Population per acre, 14 in the historic neighborhood, 4 in the new subdivision. Square feet of road per unit. Now, road is an investment that ultimately has to be made and then remade by the public side. So 1,000 square feet of road per unit in the historic neighborhood, 2,200 square feet in the subdivision. Taxes per acre, 22,000 in the historic district, 5,000 in the new subdivision. Then sooner or later, you're going to have to replace water and sewer lines. 8,800 per unit in the historic district, 25,000 in the new subdivision. And again, the developer might have put that stuff in originally, but the taxpayers are going to have to do the replacement of that. Annual property taxes from the 2 neighborhoods, 2.2 million from the historic neighborhood, 610,000. Where's the fiscal responsibility? And that's coming from that density that those historic neighborhoods provide. But even in New York, the real estate community in New York is saying, we've got a city that's fixed in boundaries. Population is growing, so the only thing we can do is go up. So we got to build these gazillion-story skyscrapers. Okay, all right, understand. True, absolutely true. And so we looked at, I think there's been 21 skyscrapers, residential skyscrapers over 500 meters built since 2001. So we looked in the lowest census unit where those have been built and looked at what the change in population in those areas was over that period, again in population per square mile. So they added density a lot. Started at 9718 people per square mile, and it goes up to 105,000. So they were right. They added density. But the historic districts already had density of 144,000 per square mile. They need to add density. But something like 3%, 3.5% of all of the lots in the city of New York are under the purview of the Preservation Commission. Yeah, add density, but for God's sake, don't be adding it in the place. And the real estate community is saying, you got to get rid of the historic districts because they're killing our affordable housing, they're killing our density. But you idiots, that's where the density is. Look other places. In fact, that's true in all 5 boroughs of New York. Higher density in the historic districts. This issue of walkability. You probably all know, but you can today, there's a thing called walkscore.com. You can go to the computer, type in walkscore.com, type in any address in America, and it'll give you a walk score from 1 to 100. Great, really influential statistic that's been emerging over the last few years, indicated by the fact it was started up by some kind of planners on a nonprofit basis. So important in terms of property values, it was acquired by a for-profit real estate firm, the whole measurement, because it's so significant. So we looked at walk scores in San Antonio. Mission District, again, this kind of too big district, frankly. Lower, every other historic district, national and local, in San Antonio, had a higher walk score than did the city as a whole. In Raleigh, nice city, but a walk score as a city as a whole, 29, making it a car-dependent city. Local historic district, walk score of 82. Here is Savannah. Once again, every single historic district but one has a higher walk score than does the city. So these are one of the reasons there's this preservation premium is those historic neighborhoods are walkable, and people are paying for lots of things, but this walkability is one of them. Then this issue about the knowledge and creative industries. Again, it'll never be the giant chunk of the economy, but it's important kind of to catalyze other activities. The state of North Carolina decided that they wanted to have an emphasis on getting more workers in this knowledge and creative class category. And they don't have a lot in the state of North Carolina, a little less than 2%. City of Raleigh, not unexpectedly, has more. Local National Register districts have more. And then the local districts, that's where people are going. There's a concept in kind of economic analysis called revealed preference. In that we could say right now, we could have a little poll. How many of you prefer vanilla ice cream? Raise your hands. Then how many of you prefer chocolate ice cream? That raise your hand. So that's just a direct survey, but we could do it a different way. We could have a waiter come in with a tray with both chocolate and vanilla, and you take one. And then we know as well, because that's your revealed preference. How you acted indicates your preference. Well, so a lot of the work we do is this kind of revealed preference. What are people doing? Well, what are they doing? These people in those knowledge and creative industries are choosing to be in historic neighborhoods. Here is the city of New York. 8% of all the jobs in the city of New York are in the historic district. But 10% of the professional and scientific, 13% of information, 14% of educational service. And look at that one, 20% of all of the jobs in the entertainment, recreation, and arts area are in historic districts. 2.5 times the propensity of being in jobs in historic districts in general. Here is Savannah. Share of all jobs, about 30% are in historic districts. All of those knowledge worker jobs are more likely to be in historic districts. Then one of my favorites, actually, it's kind of a geeky statistic, but this issue of business births and deaths. One of the measurements that the Department of Commerce keeps every year is how many businesses opened, how many closed. And of course, to have a growing economy, you have to have more businesses opening than closing. And the ratio over the long term tends to be something between 1.1 and 1.2 to 1, meaning 11 or 12 businesses opening for every 10 that close. So here's what happened nationally during the recession. So you start out in 2, 4, 5, and 6, and you see the average of slightly over 1, 1.2, 1.3, so that's kind of normal. You see that the recession started at the end of 2007. You see that 2007 starting to dip down, then 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, in fact, more businesses closed than opened. So that's when we were in the depth of the recession. That's what happened. Now, we looked at Main Street communities in 3 or 4 Main Street states. And because they have to keep the data, we could go back and say how many businesses opened, how many closed. And here was the answer: in Michigan, New Mexico, and North Carolina. Now, think about, those are very different states. North Carolina, kind of prosperous economy. Michigan, kind of has struggles. New Mexico, in fact, is quite outside of Albuquerque and Santa Fe, quite a poor. So it didn't matter. In every one of those cases, through the depths of the recession, they were opening more businesses than were closing. That's a big deal. More than was happening in the nation, more than was happening in the rest of their state. They, in fact, were surviving and prospering against the kind of overall national trends. This issue about, I'm a absolute unequivocal capitalist, but I think that real capitalism today comes from small firms, not the giants. Giants tend to be anti-competitive. Little guys are where the real job growth, job creation, job stability comes from. And so this issue about small businesses and startup businesses, I think, is a real important indicator of the health of the whole economy. So here you have, once again, 3.4% of the lots in New York are in historic districts, 8% of the private sector jobs, but small jobs at small firms, meaning firms less than 20 people, small startup firms, young firms. All of them have a greater likelihood to be in historic districts than the kind of job pattern in general. You don't have to believe this is important. This is no kind of social test, and you can accept it or not from your perspective. It doesn't matter to me. But I happen to believe that if we're going to have healthy cities, that we need at the neighborhood level human beings that mirror the breadth of the citizens of that city. In age, in income, in ethnicity, in race. I think that healthy neighborhoods are ones that kind of reflect the whole city. So we've looked at that a lot. And here was household income in San Antonio. Now, for those of you who aren't kind of statistics geeks, let me tell you what this is. So that this is the share of the population in each of these incomes. So around in the San Antonio as a whole, about 28% of households have household income less than $25,000 a year. At the other end, about 11% in San Antonio have incomes over $150,000. But those lines are largely parallel. The exception being there's more of the poorest and more of the richest in the historic districts. Well, I hardly think that's a bad thing to have the richest people in town living next door to the poorest people in town. I think there's all kinds of benefits all the way around for that. Here is, when you break it down to individual historic districts, there are some that are a little skewed, some that are considerably poorer, considerably richer, but for the most part, individually, those historic districts are a reflection of the income distribution as a whole. Here's race in San Antonio. Again, who lives in the city and who lives in the historic districts, almost an exact mirror. The only trouble with this one is there's not very big African-American population. Only about 6% of the population in San Antonio is African-American. The big indicator there is Latinos. About 63% of the population of San Antonio is Latino, and virtually the same number, 60% in fact of those live in historic districts. So we have this kind of mirror that, and again, this is a myth buster. Too long, I think there's those of us beyond the preservation field say that preservation is kind of fine, I guess, but it's for saving the mansions of rich dead white guys. Well, that's not what preservation is anymore at all. It really is this reflection of the breadth of who we are as a country. Again, this is the Hispanic and non-Hispanic. There's some skew, but mostly it just reflects who's there in the city as a whole. Then there's this issue of the environment. This, by the way, is a picture from eastern Idaho, but you don't care. But so there was a investment in it wasn't Pocatello though, Jerry. So. There was a investment banker in Baltimore who'd done some of this analysis before. He teamed up with an environmental economist, and they looked at the kind of economic or environmental impact of making preservation decisions. And their model was this. Let's say that we have a need for a 50,000 square foot warehouse. And our options are we can take an existing 50,000 square foot historic building and fix it up, do whatever we need to have used for whatever our warehouse needs are, or we can go to the edge of town and build a new warehouse for 50,000 square feet. In the end, we have a building that will meet its function. That doesn't matter, but what are the environmental differences of making those decisions? And here you can find the 20 to 40% reduction of vehicle miles traveled, reduction in CO2 emissions, saved CO2 equivalent to 22,000 gallons of gasoline, embodied energy, which is the energy that was required to put that wall together originally, of 55,000 million BTUs, saved 5 acres of greenfield development, less construction debris in the landfill by 2,500 tons, and infrastructure investment saved $500,000 to $800,000. I'm telling you, the Tea Party and the Sierra Club ought to be holding hands leading the preservation parade. They're the ones that are kind of the beneficiaries. I mean, again, this is my fiscal responsibility, say 50 to 80% savings in infrastructure from reusing an existing building to build new one at the edge. One of the good things that the National Trust has done in the last few years is established a kind of research center called the Preservation Green Lab, and they did some very good peer-reviewed analysis of a variety of building typologies around the country. And here's what they found. It takes, so, everybody talks about, oh, we need to have the LEED 4-star blah, 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 green gizmo building built if we're going to be responsible. Well, it takes 10 to 80 years of the most energy efficient building to make up for the energy cost of building the damn thing. And building reused, and almost every alternative was in fact more efficient. more energy efficient in terms of rehabilitating existing buildings than building the kind of green gizmo new building. Mayor Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, before he left office, wanted to set New York City on the path to become the greenest city in the world. And good businessman that he is, he said, we got to start out and see what we're doing already. So they did energy use surveys of tens of thousands of buildings in New York City. This one didn't have anything to do with historic preservation. It had to do with energy consumption. Lo and behold, who used the least energy per square foot were the buildings built before 1920. Every decade subsequently, they were using more energy. Now, I know that many of you are diehard environmentalists, and God bless you, but we've been lied to by the environmental movement for 40 years, saying you got to get rid of those old wind-blown, leaky, historic buildings that are energy efficient. That's a lie. That's wrong. In fact, it's those buildings that were built when you had to control the environment by how you designed and sited the building that makes those energy efficient buildings 100 years later. We did a study in Utah, and we hired Robert Young, who's at the University of Utah and is an engineering geek guy. I love him, great, brilliant guy, but he's like the caricature of an engineering type. Okay? So he did this calculation of materials flow. That if you build something, you got to get something out of the ground or from the forest. You have to turn that raw material into a building material. You have to transport it to where the building's being built, incorporate it into the building, and then you use it for 30 or 40 or 50 or 80 years, and then something happens, you tear it down, you throw it away, whatever. But there's this life cycle. And so that was the way that he measured this kind of lifetime materials flow that has obviously clear, direct environmental impacts. And he modeled it this way. Let's say that we have three alternatives. We can take an historic house, modest size, 2,400 square feet, and we can retrofit it so it has all the energy efficient systems in it, so it's very energy efficient. Or we can go to the edge of town and build a new building, not a McMansion, and just a similar size, relatively small house at the edge of town. Or, and this was a surprise to me, and it may have applicability here in Boise, or we can tear down the existing building and build a new one on that site. Lo and behold, the most expensive option environmentally, in terms of materials flows, was tearing down and throwing away the historic building and rebuilding that place. The next most was going out the edge and doing it. By an order of 5 orders of magnitude, the least consumptive was to say, let's rehabilitate the existing historic building. I don't care if you like character of old buildings. If you care about the environment, we ought to be paying attention. They have a tax credit in Utah that applies to houses. People can rehabilitate their historic house to get a tax credit. And so we looked at all of those houses have been rehabilitated using the state tax credit and calculated their average size. Every time that they chose to rehabilitate instead of tear down and throw away, that made a difference of 116 tons of stuff that went into the landfill. Something between 1/4 and 1/3 of everything that goes to landfill is from construction debris. I believe in fiscally responsible government. And I don't care how high your tipping fees are, there is not a solid waste landfill in America that the tipping fees pay for its operational cost and its capital cost over its lifetime. None of them. Meaning, every time somebody goes and dumps stuff at the landfill, I don't care how much they're paying in tipping fees, the rest of us are subsidizing the throwing away of materials. That are, for those of us who are fiscally responsible, that ought to be paying attention to that. And there's this idiot. Anyone know who he is? Is the governor of California, Jerry Moonshine Brown, whatever his name is. And so here he's signing a bill that virtually bans plastic bags in California. Well, fine, I'm not against it. Fine, he did that. And the sponsor of the bill had this to say: a throwaway society is not sustainable. And I absolutely agree with him. He's right, so maybe that was a good deal. The same week that he signed the no plastic bags, he vetoed a bill for a state tax credit in California that passed both houses of the legislature, Democrats and Republicans, senators and representatives, with 0 negative votes. He vetoed it, saying, we don't want to do that stuff. So I just made some quick calculations. So if you get rid of all of the plastic bags in California every year, had you reused 49, 50,000 square foot warehouses, you'd have saved more stuff at the landfill. If you reduced in all the plastic bags in the state, you have the same effect on CO2 emissions as saving 50,000 square foot warehouses. All of the plastic bags created by one human being over their entire life takes 144 people to make up for the difference of one little house being torn down and thrown away. He's a damn idiot, I'm telling you. I don't feel strongly about that, but I just thought I'd mention that. This isn't a place that's going to. This isn't a kind of data point that affects you in Boise. That's a growing place, and many other towns and cities in Idaho, but it does in other parts of the country. And that is this: when cities decline in population, and then the population begins to grow again, where does that growth take place? And so we've looked at a number of places. I live in Washington, D.C., but every Tuesday in the spring I go up to Philly and teach a class for 3 hours. But I don't know Philly well, but I remember when the census came out, and the big headlines were finally turned the corner. That we've been losing population in Philadelphia for 50 years, and finally we're starting to grow. It's only 8,500 people, but we've turned the corner, except they didn't. The historic districts in Philadelphia grew by 12,000 people. The rest of the city is still losing people. Washington, where I live, another city that lost population for 50 years in the decade between 2000 and 2010, grew. About 45% of us in Washington, D.C. live in a historic district, but that's where 63% of the population growth took place. Here is Boston. It kind of turned the corner a decade earlier, but with the same pattern, that where their growth took place was disproportionately in the historic district. So if you want to grow back, for God's sake, don't be getting rid of the neighborhoods that are the place where people want to come. Thank you very much.